Are you ready to dive into this?
I'm ready. Let's do it.
When I was watching the trailers for Days Gone before it even released, I thought to myself, isn't this a bit redundant for Sony considering they already have The Last of Us? I mean, this game does have bikes, but a lot of what we're seeing here already looks like that same old gritty take on your typical zombie-infested post-apocalyptic American dystopia with that same old bearded gruff-voiced protagonist who of course is a bit bitter and angry because of some tragedy that happened in the past. Of course, there has to be a tragedy. Honestly, there were only two things that were interesting about the game from what the trailers and that E3 demo has shown. The first is that chase sequence, which allows the player to manipulate certain environmental spots to slow down the zombies when they're chasing you, and the other would be the sheer amount of zombies that they're able to render on screen at one time. But other than that, I was expecting Days Gone to be another generic zombie shooter game, and now fast forward when it released in 2019, the reviews from mainstream publications and on YouTube also didn't help in improving its already preconceived image on my mind. It just reaffirmed my assumptions that this is definitely one of those generic zombie shooty games.
Come on! Come on!
So after playing the game for some time now, I'm at that point where I can say that this game in some ways defied my expectations. It does not want to be another The Last of Us, and when I look at it, it's even better than most zombie games I already enjoyed in the past. Games such as Dead Rising, State of Decay, or Dying Light to name a few. By better, I mean it's not exactly perfect or flawless, I just find it more engaging to play relative to those zombie games I've mentioned. Note that this is not a full review, nor is this some video essay to persuade you of any underlying politics or ideology that the game may be tucking away in its subtext. I look at games as works of art that are defined primarily by their mechanics first, and that's what makes games games in the first place. There's already a lot of YouTubers out there that are more well-versed in sharing their insights on the deeper aspects of a game's theme or its narrative. So I'm just gonna provide you with the design observations that I've seen and tell you my reflections as a result of those design implementations. This video won't also be covering the story because I will only be looking at Days Gone from a mechanics standpoint. This means the assessment of whether the game succeeds or fails in telling a compelling story with rich characters and a deep, profound message won't be covered here. I'll just leave that up to you to discover on your own. So, with all that said, here is why Days Gone is not the generic zombie shooter I expected it to be. But before I get to the positive reasons why, let me get the bad things out of the way. Because this game is far from perfect. And here are some of the lacking elements that I've observed. Number one is the magnetic melee combat. This is certainly a negative because the melee combat in this game is just flat out bad. It's not just because it's heavily animation dependent, but the snapping of animations between the player and the enemy is poorly masked, and you can certainly see the two clashing models kind of warping into one another just for the melee animations to connect in a very jarring way, like they're being sucked into a central portal of some kind. Also, the actual mechanics are nothing more than button mashing with the occasional dodge and a quick time event. And there's no sense of rhythm to your attacks whatsoever, and mashing your attack versus attempting to time it with every weapon swing would just yield the same result. Yes, you might have to occasionally dodge roll after an enemy does a matrix evade to get away from your attack, and you might have to do some active reload quick timey event thingy to subdue an enemy, but that's just adding one different button to one attack button. They could have at least added one quick dodge button, which would result in a short range kind of evade, which for some reason the enemies can perform to you. They could also have added a strong attack button in addition to a weak attack, which would create more interesting and engaging melee combat scenarios. And I don't know why they weren't able to do this for the melee weapons, since this is the case for the other actions, but let weapon swings cost stamina. I mean, this should have been basic common sense. If you're going to tie certain actions such as rolling and sprinting to the stamina meter, why is using weapons an exception? You're literally swinging two-handed objects in the air while dealing damage to enemies. This would make the decisions on whether to engage enemies head-on or from afar more viable and lets the player think more carefully on the fly and helps them to be more deliberate in their actions. On the topic of combat, the bike combat is also archaic. Taking inspiration from the two-button melee combat, shootouts in bikes are also two-button affairs. One for securing a lock towards target and the other for firing your your handgun. It's just too simple to be engaging and renders long chase sequences where you have to take down targets very tedious and just obviously repetitive. This next thing I'm gonna mention might be extremely nitpicky for some, but for me is a constant immersion breaking annoyance. And it's all about the flashlight having no physical model for the light to attach on. As you can see here, the light on the flashlight is just a disembodied light source that is projected towards the direction of your camera. There are no models for your flashlight that could have been attached to your weapons or your chest to at least provide an illusion that you're using a flashlight. And what's more, the projection of the light is not dependent on the positioning of your physical character, but to where your view is pointed at. This results in extremely jarring moments where Deacon may be facing backwards, but the light can still project behind him. Maybe he has a flashlight at the back? What's weird though is that some NPCs do have the flashlight model and the light rendered on screen, just like this chap over here. My theory is that the devs probably found it way too cumbersome to direct the flashlight when attached to Deacon's character model, since you can rotate his body in any direction independent of where the camera is pointed at. By detaching the flashlight from Deacon and onto the camera viewpoint itself, managing where the light will point will then be more intuitive to control. I guess I just answered my own curiosity, so I guess this isn't a negative after all? The next thing is the dialogue, which sometimes doesn't make sense and at times seem awkward in how the characters deliver their lines that aren't connected naturally with the previous line they're responding to.
Yes, we used to play that hide and seek game all the time. She would just hide her head in her coat just like that.
It seems to me that the actors were probably given too much free rein in improvising their dialogue, which may have resulted in this somewhat jarring interactions during cutscenes. Characters would sometimes bring up topics that are out of left field or may simply overreact from inconspicuous and unremarkable things.
I'm gonna ask you a question, Lisa, and I need you to think real hard. Did any of your neighbors, did they own any firearms, like pistols, rifles, things like that?
No. Men came and took everything.
Men? Were they like the men in the tunnel, or did they wear uniforms like in the army?
Like the army. But they were really dirty, and They carried flags they made themselves. Deschutes County Militia, I think. I don't remember.
Did they have anyone with them?
For crafting, maybe I can forgive them since it happens on the radial menu, which brings the game to a slow motion state, and there's a visible interface to give you status updates on the progress of your crafting. But for healing, there's sadly no animations to give you an organic feedback that you're actually using a healing item. I'm playing on a survival 2 difficulty mode in order to remove the HUD, and there's just no way to know whether you're healing or not. This might not be a problem if the healing action is a simple button press, but this game decided to have healing as a hold button press. This is really weird since Deacon is pretty much well animated for the most part. He can pant after sprinting for some time, he moves his hand when picking up resources, he elaborately jimmies car hoods and trunks when looting cars, he also puts his hands up close to objects when taking cover, and has 2 separate animations for climbing high surfaces depending on whether he's holding a one-handed or a two-handed weapon. Why they couldn't animate a simple healing action is just beyond me. What's worse is this severely hampers survival during combat. You'd either have to hope you could hear that clicking sound when the healing action is starting to fill up, or you'd have to tap the middle mouse button to temporarily display the HUD, which defeats the purpose of playing the game in survival mode. The last negative I'm going to mention is less of a specific mechanic and more of a design flaw, which for me could be the biggest elephant in the room. And this has something to do with the extreme padding in story missions. Now, I'm not saying that it's padded because it is just simply slow in pacing. What I mean is that the campaign itself is structured to contain tutorialized missions in an unnecessarily long-winded stretch. Now there's a difference between a deliberate marination of slow build-up of events to enhance character relationships or tell a good, compelling story in an interesting way, versus simply stretching out the time needed for you to complete the game. Days Gone unfortunately suffers the latter, in which some story missions aren't even legit story missions, but feel more like side missions crammed away of a story event. Now, this isn't much of an issue if you're the type of gamer or player who just plays for the sake of playing it, and the reward is the experience of playing itself. But when you're looking forward to seeing the game through to its completion, because you're an adult with other real-life responsibilities or even other games to complete in your backlog, Days Gone may be fatigue-inducing. So those are the flaws that stood out to me. If you think that I'm beating on the game too much, please take note that I'm just being honest with the things that I have objectively observed. Quite contrary, the existence of these negatives should actually prove that this game is special because despite those flaws, Days Gone is still a good game overall and I love it. Now, let's proceed to the strengths of this game's design. Despite his brooding nature, which would have made you expect him as the cliched, few-worded, gruff-sounding Batman character, Deacon talks to himself a lot, and I mean a lot.
Alright, let's see if they got an underground bunker around here.
This is a stark contrast to other games where the characters, no matter how emotionally driven in cutscenes, instantly turn into an empty avatar during gameplay. The way Deacon is given life here in Days Gone, however, he remains the same asshole that he is during cutscenes and stays that way during routine gameplay.
Something called Law and Order are a thing of the past. What are you talking about? But yeah, you got a point about force being the only thing that matters now. Force. And a lot of goddamn ammo.
He would constantly quip side remarks when picking up items,
Fuel can. Okay, might be useful.
going inside certain territories,
Goddamn rippers. I'm going to kill all of you.
or killing certain enemies. Even when you're just randomly roaming outside a story mission,
That's the last of them. Guess your days of setting ambushes around here are over.
on paper, this is not something new or groundbreaking, but this deliberate decision to implement incidental dialogue, regardless of whether it's a crucial story event or a trivial activity, provides a consistent characterization of Deacon, which makes him stay in character even after the cutscenes have stopped rolling. If my memory serves me right, this has been the only game I can recall which is able to achieve this kind of persistent characterization that blends cutscenes and gameplay. You may hate Deacon as a character since he's certainly a huge jerk, but you can't deny the level of effort dedicated in making him consistent as a character both in and out of cutscenes. Huge credits to the actor Sam Witwer as well. You may not find the writing to be that sharp or well written, but the performance by Sam to bring Deacon to life is truly a commendable one.
Hey, I'm unarmed! I'm unarmed! Get out! Now listen to me! My girl's out there, she's been stabbed. We're just trying to get to the roof. There's a helicopter waiting. So listen. You killed my wife!
Oh, no. Look, I didn't know anything about your wife.
I love how he can occasionally stutter his words and use different inflections on his voice in order to convey a kind of interaction between people. Again, I'm not saying Deacon is a great character in and of himself, but it's that level of care and attention given to make him a believable character that finally addresses the narrative dissonance, which deserves a genuine commendation.
What are you looking at? I don't know, just waiting for you to smarten the fuck up.
Don't! What I'm going to say about the bike in this game is more about the design of its system itself and its surrounding mechanics rather than the physical bike alone. Because what you're going to pick up when simply watching YouTube videos is just the mere existence of a bike. And I'm afraid that people will watch those videos and assume that it's just another vehicle gimmick thrown in to add a unique stamp to the game. And well, that might be true from a marketing standpoint, but I'm happy to tell you that the bike system in this game has more mechanical depth than you might think. Let me start first with the handling because it's the most obvious and doesn't necessarily steal the show. As it should, since this isn't a racing game, though it's very fortunate for Days Gone to have a handling system that's not a chore to control. The steering has some heft to it, ensuring that you decide which path to take well before taking a turn, but it still manages to remain responsive enough to not add to the burden of this already stressful game. Now, I'm going to proceed to the surrounding mechanics that coalesce to a distinct transportation experience. These are the fuel mechanic and the clutch mechanic. Now, we all know that fuel as a resource in open world games is already present in other games such as Mafia, but it's on how this is used in Days Gone in conjunction with the clutch mechanic that's a true standout for me. This clutch mechanic allows the player to move forward in a stealthy way without using the accelerator to generate noise. This means that fuel isn't consumed and freakers can't hear you when their backs are turned. However, this comes at the cost of a very slow movement speed. Now, why is this something commendable exactly? Well, because the player's capacity to travel faster is converted into a necessity that needs to be conserved and managed, the clutch mechanic allows the player to take risks and make an instinctive decision on whether to floor the accelerator to gain a speed advantage while wasting fuel and give away your location, or choose to move slowly and stop fuel consumption while moving the camera around with anxiety, hoping that no enemy would come out of nowhere and rush towards you. Now this may already sound very fitting for the theme of the game and adds another layer of gameplay that perfectly coheres with its survival direction, but this philosophy doesn't end here. Let me go ahead and introduce the environment. Now, when I say environment, I'm not talking about the size of the map or its verisimilitude to the Pacific Northwest. Those are not my concerns in this video. But what I'm going to point out are the elements that compose the environment. First, the topography. Earlier, when I previously mentioned the fuel and clutch mechanic, those weren't actually all the ingredients of Days Gone's transportation design. There's still a missing one, which makes for a holy trinity of some kind. And that's the topography of Oregon. Specifically, it's the way roads are constructed and laid out in such a way that some go uphill and some go downhill. Now what this does is it reminds the player of certain road patterns which, if one were to be deliberate in driving, could drastically aid the player in conserving fuel. For example, when you know there's a downhill after a specific turn, you'd be able to save fuel by disengaging your clutch and rely on the built-up momentum as fuel substitute for moving forward well after the road returns to a level ground. On the other hand, when you're expecting an incline, you'd know you've got to use the accelerator. This design decision for Oregon's road contours and the aforementioned bike mechanic not just adds another parameter to the survival element of this game, but allows for creative fuel management. This is oddly satisfying when pulled off successfully. Moving around the map from one campsite to another location is not just a simple follow the waypoint thing, and it now involves studying how many dips and turns the path to it would take, how much fuel you have left, and how much distance the nearest fuel source there is along the way. Also, I would like to point out how long the corpses stay in the ground. It's a pretty simple, trivial thing, but seeing the dead carcasses of people and zombies you have killed, even from hours ago, still there lying on the ground on the exact same spot where you've dispatched them, is a neat reminder of how much you've already progressed and further enhances that sense of adventure. Now on to the topic of suspense. The presence of multiple tunnels that connect some of the regions of the map is a very wise design choice for me. What it does is it breaks the feeling of openness and freedom of movement found in the wide open terrain and creates this temporary sense of claustrophobia that's unavoidable since these tunnels cannot be circumvented. And it's quite tense going through the dark, cramped tunnels, carefully weaving through cars, deciding whether to go off your bike to gather resources or keep going forward and moving the camera around for any sudden movements from possum playing freakers. I was actually surprised how they were able to preserve these sections for the open world proper well after having went through them as a linear level in the opening sequence of the game. Great job on that front. Also, I'd like to especially highlight the implementation of diegetic design in this game. For those who don't know, diegesis is a Greek style of storytelling in which elements of a narrative are presented to the audience as they would exist on that fiction's world. For example, when you hear music coming from a source that's being recognized by the fictional characters inside a film, that is called diegetic music. When adapted to video games now, this could mean elements that are both privy to the player and the in-game avatar. For example, the HUD in the first Half-Life, which only appears after Gordon wears the HEV suit, or bring up the map in Far Cry 2, which doesn't pause the game but continues in real time. This removes any form of dissonance between what the in-game avatar is doing and what the actual player is experiencing. Now for Days Gone, looting vehicles is one example. Not only will the progress bar appear when hoods and trunks are being looted, but there's an animation that would trigger every time instead of the typical telepathic interaction. Just like what is seen in the new Assassin's Creed games. Moreover, vehicles that are already looted will have their respective hoods and trunks raised slightly. This provides a diegetic feedback on which vehicles are lootable or not without relying on non-diegetic elements like floating text or markers that break immersion. The same contextual progress bars also appears when refueling gas or repairing your bike. If you'd like to know more about the use of diegesis for gameplay immersion, I'll just be linking this blog post from Gamasutra in the description box down below. I encourage you all to read it since it provides a lot of insight into some of the organic elements we have been interacting with that we don't give any conscious attention to. In Days Gone, you are constantly vulnerable, even in bikes. Human enemies, mutated wolves, and even the freakers themselves can knock you off and take a chunk of health right off of you. This means that you have to be very particular of what you're doing at all times. In fact, you can even slam into closed metal doors when you're not careful sprinting.
Shit! Shit!
Suppressors can break, requiring a calculated use of stealth shots, and even the typical Far Cry outpost mechanic is adapted here with more depth in that securing these checkpoints isn't a simple kill all enemies to win thing. You'd have to secure many things first prior to the actual clearing, like you'd have to make sure the generator is repaired, that it has ample fuel, that there are fuses available to power it, and that all alarms are disabled prior to turning on the generator. This alarm mechanic is quite interesting because you'd have to pay attention to the power cables that are connecting these alarms from different spots. So in addition to assessing what's going down below, you'd also have to look up and ensure that you're not missing any alarms while managing how to neutralize the threats down below. It's an engaging exercise that feels suspenseful every time since the layouts of these checkpoints are different from each other. So you won't be doing the same approach over and over again. Take note, Ubisoft. Now, all of what I've said wouldn't have mattered as much if the bulk of what you're doing to progress isn't that great. And I'm talking about the rest of the combat. Fortunately, while the melee combat is indeed atrocious, the shootouts in this game are just pure awesome. First, the sound design in this game is excellent. All guns in this game pack a real solid punch. They might be a bit more exaggerated in terms of the bass, but I love them, not in spite of it, but because of it. Even the pistols sound deadly in this game, and it's not just the sound coming from your own guns that are good. I love how grazing bullets whistle by you and the sound of objects being hit beside you just adds to a beautiful cacophony. Also, this might have been similar to The Last of Us Part 2, but human enemies in this game call out to each other and react when they see their comrades go down one by one. It's a neat little touch which adds to the simulated chaos of this game that's enjoyable to hear. And this another little thing is important to me since this is why I think the Uncharted games are not that enjoyable. Bullet sponge enemies. And it's not just enemies having an absurd amount of HP that makes them seem like mechanical robots hiding in human flesh, but it's the lack of an invisible response when being hit. The enemies in this game, however, react to being shot, depending on which body part is being hit. This makes for convincing shootouts in terms of how it's presented to the player, and it effectively covers up the not so impressive AI in this game. But even if the AI for the Freakers and humans is not that impressive in each of their own vacuums, the way they intertwine with one another is the one that's entertaining. Kiting Freakers and other mutated creatures inside ambush camps never gets old, and it's very satisfying to clear out an ambush camp even without killing any single human enemy yourself. Another facet worthy of mention is how the enemies are animated to serve a functional gameplay purpose. For example, when deciding to stealth enemies, Freakers are still dangerous due to the fact that they consistently move their heads from side to side. This means that coming from behind isn't a sure kill because there's still a chance that they can detect you as soon as they whip their head towards you. The other game that reminds me of this is the Batman Arkham games, where Rocksteady was able to neuter the overpowered nature of Batman by implementing enemy behavior that would become erratic in scanning their environment as soon as they become agitated from seeing their comrades picked off by Batman. Also, when detected, both humans and Freakers would move their heads so much that it's hard to secure a fast headshot. This adds to what I've been saying earlier about the game putting the player in a constant sense of danger. And these are effective decisions because it doesn't rely on arbitrary, non-diegetic elements that would impede the player, but remains consistent with the internal logic of its game world, which preserves immersion. It's just a shame that they can do the same thing to healing. It's really mind-boggling why that isn't animated. Now, before I close this video, I'm just gonna point out other details that are very trivial on paper but significantly add to the experience when being compounded to one another. First, the saving system. I love how the quick save is implemented to only be doable when near safe houses and your bike. This is a neat touch that gives value to your bike beyond being a mere transportation vehicle. Also, quick saves in Days Gone are legit quick saves that store your exact location upon reloading. I hate games that say they have quick saves but are only doing approximate checkpoints and just simply teleports you to some story beat or some hub area upon reloading, even if you're saving in a far away location. Second, the merchants in this game talk to Deacon at a more personal level. Even when browsing through menus, Deacon would converse with his people, and I thought that this was a part of some story mission or something, but it's just actually purely incidental.
Hey, haven't seen Boozer around much lately.
Yeah, he's around. I guess he's just been doing more work for Copeland lately.
You tell him I said get off his ass and do some work for me.
Yeah, I'll let him know.
I love how Deacon would also call them by name even when just walking by, and this just makes their sparse world feel inhabited.
Hey there.
Jazzy.
See you, man.
Bye, Jazzy.
Hey, Deke.
Manny.
All right, check back later, man. See ya.
Inhabited by living creatures that have personalities of their own. As to whether they're good characters or not is not the point of this video. I'm just gonna leave that subjective assessment to you. So that's it for me. I hope I was able to articulate my thoughts in a clear way that you can understand. Please tell me what are your thoughts on Days Gone 2. Have you also enjoyed it? If not, well, just tell me why in the comments down below. Thank you very much, everyone. I hope you all have a wonderful day. Stay safe. Bye-bye.